Okay, there we go. Small technical hiccup. Thank you for joining me today. Those of you that are here, hope everybody is doing well. And today we're going to be looking at comparative primate anatomy. So we're going to be looking at how different primates' bodies are put together, mostly in terms of their dental arrangements and in terms of their physical mobility, their locomotion, that is, their ability to move around. So our learning objectives for today are pretty simple. We're going to look at the four major primate diets and what the main adaptations are for consuming each of those food sources. We're going to define the major types of primate locomotion, that is, movement, how individuals get around in the world. And we're going to identify social organization of primate groups based on their degree of sexual dimorphism. So last week we talked about the different kinds of social organization, and we'll run through those quickly again today, and then look at how those different kinds of organization relate to anatomy. And again, I made a supplementary video playlist to reinforce some of the concepts, especially for locomotion. There's nothing better than just watching the different kinds of primates move around on video. In this case, not all the videos could be saved to a playlist because they have some content restrictions on them. So again, there's a complete list in Canvas, and I recommend taking a look at that to get the full thing. You can watch the playlist, but there are a few videos that won't be in there. And there's also some good comparative primate anatomy resources on the internet that I am still compiling, and I'll be posting a list of links to those later. So if you want to look at some of the material that we would look at in lab normally, you'll be able to look at some of that as well. Okay, so why are we interested in primate anatomy in the first place? I mean, that seems more like the kind of thing you would study in a wildlife biology class. Well, obviously, some traits are better suited than others for specific behaviors, right? That's what natural selection acts on. So natural selection puts pressure on individuals, and if they have traits that allow them to survive and reproduce more effectively, those traits become more prevalent in the population, right? The proportion of that genotype increases. And this can include behavior as well as physical traits. So if you have one group of animals that stick together better and are better able to cooperate, and another set of animals of the same species that are not able to cooperate, then the survival of the cooperating ones will probably be better, and that means that the tendency to cooperate as a behavior will also get passed on. And so we can't always see behavior, right, because there are primates that we can't observe directly. We don't always have the opportunity to do field studies. And there are also extinct primates, like all of our ancestors, right, are extinct, Neanderthals and so on. And so if we want to understand what their behavior was, we rely on reference to the analogy of their anatomical adaptations. So we look at a modern primate, and we see something like this primate has a certain bone structure, and then we look at an extinct primate, and we see that that primate has a similar bone structure. We can infer that those individuals had similar behaviors. So a good example is that if we find a fossil with huge molars, which is something that we do have, we have early human ancestors that have extremely large molar teeth. We can look around and find an existing primate that also has large molars and look at their diet. And so, for instance, gorillas have large molars. We look at the diet of the gorilla, and we see that they eat a lot of leaves. And then we go back, and that tells us that probably that fossil primate also ate a lot of leaves. And that's just a simple example, but there are many behaviors that we can attempt to assess in that way. So here's just an example. The first thing we're going to look at is dentition, which is the main thing that tells us about primate diet. And so there's a wide variety of primate dentition. Of course, we have a very generalized dentition because we eat all kinds of foods, but many primates are more specialized, and they have more specialized tooth arrangements as a result. And so we're going to go through the main kinds of primate diets and look at what the adaptations are for each of them. one of the first things we see is that body size also tends to correlate with diet. So very large animals, think about a cow, right? They're relatively slow moving. They consume a lot of low energy food and take a long time to digest it. And if you go down the scale, you might get to something like a squirrel, right, that moves around pretty rapidly and eats lots of nuts, maybe some small berries. And then you have like something like a hummingbird where they're eating extremely high concentrated amounts of energy and they're very small and move very rapidly. So in primates, what we see is that folivores, leaf eaters, are the largest individuals. Insectivores, insect eaters, tend to be the smallest, and frugivores, fruit eaters, sit somewhere in the middle. So why is that? Because different kinds of food have different kinds of energy profiles, right? If you eat an energy bar, that's very different from eating a salad in terms of what it gives you based on the amount of time you spend preparing and eating it. And so for primates, since they have a wider range of diets, that results in different body sizes. In addition, if you specialize in eating a certain kind of food, then you want to have specialized tools to help you eat that kind of food. So some foods are more difficult to chew, some foods are more difficult to digest, and they require special adaptations to facilitate that. So maybe a special kind of tooth or a special kind of digestive tract. And again, you can think of cows, which you probably learned at some point have 4 stomachs, right? So ruminants have multiple stomachs where they pass the food around and digest it extremely slowly in stages over time. There are no primates with 4 stomachs, but there are primates with longer digestive tracts that fulfill a similar purpose. And again, this is useful for interpreting the fossil record. Teeth are one of the most frequently found things. Remember that teeth are not bone, they're their own kind of material. And so they're extremely durable, and they preserve well in the fossil record, and they're also numerous, right? So you have 32 teeth, and we only need to find a few of them in order to give some clue as to what your diet was. If we find your molars without the front of your mandible, that's still enough to tell us something about your diet. And we're diet generalists, as are chimpanzees, our closest relative, but most primates are more specialized. They tend to focus on one kind of food or another, and we'll look at some examples of that. So the first diet type that we need to be aware of is insectivory. It's insect eating. So insects are a great source of calories if you can catch them. They're very high in protein, and they represent a very small packet of energy that you can access quickly. And for that reason, they're mostly eaten by very small-bodied primates, right? Because if you were a large primate, if you were us, and you wanted to subsist on grasshoppers, you could do it, but you would have to eat tons and tons and tons and tons of grasshoppers in order to get a lot of energy. And where people are eating grasshoppers now, they're usually processed into a meal or a flour, right? So it's just like you only can eat 1 wheat grain at a time. If you grind it up, you can make it into bread. So what do you need as far as adaptations goes in order to eat insects? Well, insects are crunchy, right? All the good stuff is inside that shell or that carapace. And so in order to access that, you need something to pierce and crunch that carapace. And so most insectivores have molars that are pointed. So if you think about your molar, or if you run your tongue over your molar in the back of your mouth, there's a ridge there, but it's basically flat. Insectivores have molars that have a high ridge on the outside edge. And that can be seen a little bit in the bottom right there. And they use that basically as a blade to chop through the shell of the insect. Then as far as digestion goes, well, the insect is basically just a bunch of guts and goo inside, and that is protein. And so you can just, once you crack them open, you can just slurp that out, and the energy is right there. So again, these individuals, these species, have short, simple digestive tracts because they just swallow that insect insides, and it's available immediately as energy. They don't have to digest it a lot. And so the primate genuses that tend to be insectivores are tarsiers, lorises, and marmosets, which are all off on the far end of the family tree from us, and they all share that same small body size and certain other adaptations. They're mostly arboreal, right, living in trees, and because they're small, they have that short digestive tract. Okay, then we have an unusual adaptation called gumnivory. This is eating gum from trees, and we don't have a lot of gum-producing trees here. So as an example, I have a chicle tree from where I work in Belize. This is where chewing gum comes from. That's why they're called chiclets, right? Because the original product was chicle. And this is a tree with a very gummy inside material, sap. And so the way you harvest that is you slash it with a machete back and forth, and you let the tree basically bleed, and you put, it's kind of hard to see, but you put a bag at the bottom there, and you cut the channel so all the gum flows into the bag. And you take that bag and you cook it, and then you sell that to chewing gum manufacturers. Well, we can't eat that gum and process it for energy, but some of the smaller primates can. And so here's an example of a marmoset. He's licking a little patch where gum is seeping out of a tree, and they're able to process that as energy. And so tree gum and tree sap, again, is an extremely quick shot of energy. Think of an energy shot, or if you've ever eaten something like power goo when you're doing sports, right? It's just pure concentrated gel, basically, that is extremely high in sugar. And so there are very few animals, very few primates that are pure gumnivores. Most of the gumnivores are also insectivores. So they have a mixed diet where they focus on insects but eat gums as a supplement. And so again, they tend to be small-bodied. And in order to access the gum, they have a special tooth adaptation, which is something called a dental comb. And that's shown in this image right here. So their incisors have been modified over time through adaptation to point outwards and be extremely close together and form this little comb-shaped tool. And they use that essentially to scrape the bark until it pops off and then rip the tree underneath, and that causes the sap to flow out, which they can then lick up. And so the first video on the playlist is a great example of, I think it's marmosets accessing gum in this manner. And it is convenient because another thing that's often under tree bark is insects. So there's a lot of beetles and ants and other similar insects that live under tree bark, and so when you scrape that tree bark off to get the gum, the insects are also there and you can access them as well. And so again, this is like pure sugar, right? And so gums are easy to digest if you have the ability to digest them, and so they require a short, simple digestive tract, which most of these animals have. And so again, this is mostly limited to lorises and some lemurs and marmosets. There are no large primates like old world monkeys that subsist on gums. So the main thing to remember here is the dental comb. That's a frequent test question, is to show the dental comb in some way, ask you to identify it, and ask you what it is used for. Okay, then we move on to something a little more familiar, and that's frugivory, eating fruit. Okay, fruits contain an intermediate amount of energy, so think about a banana, right? Banana is a good snack. If you eat one banana, you're probably going to be hungry in a few hours, but you could eat bananas all day, and that would probably keep you going, but it's not what you would personally prefer. However, there are primates that are adapted to subsist on that kind of food. And so because fruits contain an intermediate amount of energy, we see them being mostly consumed by medium-sized primates, right? The investment in climbing the tree or something like that is not worth it for something like a gorilla, but for an orangutan or a chimpanzee, or for most New World monkeys, fruits are both accessible and sufficient to their energy needs. So what do you need in order to eat fruit? And you can think of, when you eat fruit, right, what does your mouth do when you eat a banana or when you eat an apple? And if you want to think about it, you could take out an apple or banana and eat it very slowly and think about what you're doing carefully, kind of feel what your teeth are doing, maybe eat it in the mirror, right? These are good ways to investigate these things. And what you'll find is the tooth adaptations that you're using, you're going to be using mostly your incisors to bite and shear through the fruit, and then your molars to grind up the fruit material and process it. And so in order to do that, you need wide shovel-like incisors. And so we have this incisor pattern that we see where this is the back of the incisor and it's curved into kind of a shovel shape. And this is important because later when we look at human ancestors, we will see that there are individuals who are pretty much like us below the neck, but in their mouth they have shovel-shaped incisors. And there are human populations today that have shovel-shaped incisors, not all of them, but many. It's a trait that's been passed down to us. It's no longer extremely functional, but it still exists, right? And so we can trace our ancestry back to fruit-eating primates through the existence of that trait in our mouths. And at the same time, you have molars that have relatively low rounded cusps, so shown in the center here. And if you think about our molars, they're not this flat, but they are flatter than those of insectivores. So we have some vestige of that adaptation as well. In the digestive tract, fruit's easy to digest. Remember, we're eating a ripe fruit because all of us, all primates, have forward binocular vision that sees in color, so we can find ripe fruit. So we're not out there eating green bananas or unripe mangoes or hard berries that haven't been ripened yet. We're eating ripe fruit, and therefore it's relatively simple to digest. And so for that, we have, again, a simple digestive tract, but the intestine is longer. It does take more time than just sucking down gum or a grasshopper, right? So it takes some more digestive time. So who eats fruit? Who's a frugivore? Most primates are frugivores to some extent. Some lemurs and lorises, remember that lemurs especially fill all different kinds of niches. Many New World and Old World monkeys mostly eat fruit, and they're often very specialized even to certain kinds of fruit. So you might have multiple species of monkey in one area that are able to get along because they focus on different kinds of fruit for their diets. And then some of the non-human apes, so gibbons and orangutans, both eat quite a lot of fruit. They're larger than most New World monkeys, but smaller than chimpanzees and gorillas. All right, then we move on to folivory. So folivores are leaf eaters, and we distinguish that. It's not the same as herbivores, right? So herbivores, like cows, eat mostly grass. Grass is technically something a little different than a leaf, botanically speaking. And so gorillas, for instance, don't eat grass. They eat tree leaves and bush leaves, which are something a little distinct. So, however, they have something in common with large ruminants like cows in that the leaves they eat are an extremely limited source of energy that takes a long time to digest. So what adaptations do you have if that is the case? You have a relatively large body because it's going to take a long time to stand around and digest that food, and you're going to have to eat a lot of it. So you're going to be in one place for a long time, and therefore you have to be able to defend yourself and ward off predators. So relatively large body. In the teeth, you're going to be crushing and grinding tons of leaves, right? So you're going to be chewing all the time, and for that you need very large molars with shearing crests for shredding those leaves up, right? Because you're going to have to chew them into a pulp that you can then digest. On the other hand, your incisors are going to be relatively small because you're not using them very much. So the focus is on the molars. In folivores, we also see some special cranial adaptations, so adaptations in the structure of their skull. Because the diet involves so much chewing, you need to have a relatively large, strong jaw, right? Think if you were chewing gum all day, you would want to have your jaw gets sore eventually, and so you want to have a large jaw to help you do that. And you're also going to have an extremely large zygomatic muscle, and therefore a large zygomatic arch in order to carry that muscle. And we'll look at a better picture of that in a moment. But the main thing that requires in folivores is that they have something called a sagittal crest. So in this picture up on the right here, you can see a gorilla skull, and it has this fin of bone on top of it, okay? And that is an attachment point for the jaw muscle. So the jaw muscle runs from the mandible here through the zygomatic arch up over the skull, and then it attaches in folivores to the sagittal crest. So in us, it just goes up and attaches here, and that's enough of a connection point. But if a gorilla had such a light jaw muscle attachment, his jaw would not function properly. And so he has that sagittal crest to carry the extra stress of constantly chewing. And that's why gorillas have this high head. Okay, their whole skull doesn't go up. This is all head muscle attaching to the sagittal crest up here. Again, we'll look at a better picture on the next slide. And if you're wondering about how this works, you can feel your own zygomatic muscle. So one thing I always recommend when we're in class is that you put your hand right here. This is where your zygomatic arch is here in your cheekbone. Put your fingers here and then clench your jaw as if you were chewing gum. And you can feel your zygomatic muscle flexing and pulsing as you do that. Okay? And so then just imagine that instead of having this little muscle right here, you had a huge muscle that wrapped around the top of your head, attached to the top of your skull, and that whenever you chewed, you felt that entire muscle flexing all over the side of your head. That's what it's like to be a gorilla. And so this is important when we trace human evolution, because we have ancestors that have sagittal crests. They're not as extreme as the ones shown here in the gorilla, but they're very evident when we look at their skulls, and we'll be looking at their skulls in another week or two. And so, by the comparative method, we can tell that those ancestors must have been folivores to an extent that we are not. So, leaves are hard to digest, takes a long time. So just like cows, not just like cows, in a way similar to cows, folivores have much longer, much more complex digestive tracts to hold all those leaves and digest them over time. And so who is a folivore? Mostly gorillas are the primary example, but there are some old world colobine monkeys that are mostly folivores, and howler monkeys in the New World are mostly folivores with some frugivory thrown in for good measure. Okay, so here's the comparison of a human skull and a gorilla skull. As you can see, our temporal muscle just attaches to the side of our skull and is relatively small. And by comparison, the gorilla has this massive muscle attaching the jaw to the zygomatic arch and a massive muscle running up the side of the skull and attaching to the sagittal crest along the entire top of their head. All right? And so the ancestors of humans that have sagittal crests often have a morphology that's kind of halfway between the human skull on the left and the gorilla skull on the right. Again, we'll be looking at examples of that in another lecture. Okay, so that's a summary of primate diet. You should be able to, for an exam, identify the 4 kinds of primate diet and what the major adaptations and features are that we see in individuals that have that diet. So a typical exam question would be something like, here is a primate that has a very short, simple digestive tract and a dental comb. What is their most likely primary diet source? Or on the other hand, here is a primate that eats mostly fruit. What are the main adaptations you would expect to see in that individual in terms of processing their diet? Okay, the other major factor in determining body morphology is the method of locomotion. So it just means moving around. How do you get around? And how you get around has a lot to do with how your body is shaped. So obviously the way we get around is quite different from the way, say, a dog gets around, even though we're both able to move in similar ways, in similar environments, right? We do it very differently. And again, once we know what physical traits go with each kind of locomotion, we can use the comparative method to understand how a species that's no longer here must have moved around. And we can then trace our ancestry by looking at whether we still have certain traits that relate to kinds of locomotion that we no longer do. which we have quite a few of. And this is where I have focused most of the extra videos, because they show these kinds of locomotion in some detail and very simply, and you can often see how humans do some of these things even though they're not our primary method of locomotion. So the first kind of locomotion that we'll look at is something called vertical clinging and leaping. And there's a great video of this on the playlist. Vertical clinging and leaping is practiced mostly by tarsiers, although there are also some lemurs and lorises that do it, and it's an arboreal adaptation. So if you're a small animal that lives mostly in trees, right, in the tarsier's case, mostly in sort of thin trees, not big trees like pine trees like we have here, but thin jungle softwood trees, you basically live in a giant sort of bamboo forest. And so how do you get around effectively without walking on the ground too much? You do it through VCL. So the main adaptation for VCL is that your body is oriented vertically. These individuals spend most of their time hanging on the side of a tree, as shown here. And so in order to do that, they have very long fingers in order to grasp on to the tree constantly. And then, and you have to watch the video in order to really get this, what they do is they literally bounce sideways and just catch on to the next tree. It's a really weird looking sort of movement. And so when they catch onto that tree, they have, again, long fingers, and to push off of the first tree, they have extremely large legs relative to their arms. So you can see the tarsier here, his legs are practically as long as his whole body, while his arms are very short. And then they have long feet to push off with, and very large ankle bones. Their calcaneus is relatively large because they use that as a shock absorber when they catch on to the next tree. So again, just watch the video. It will all make sense when you see it in action. Okay, another common primate form of locomotion is something called brachiation. And brachiation goes with a behavior called suspensory locomotion, which is hanging or suspending from tree branches. So when you think of a monkey, this might be the kind of thing that you think about, right? The monkey hanging from the tree. And brachiation then is the swinging from tree branch to tree branch, right? The other behavior that we associate with monkeys. And it's done arm over arm. So usually I would demonstrate this in class. Can't do that here, of course. But you can imagine, right, if you were on the monkey bars on the playground, that you would swing arm over arm. We do it very poorly. I have a video of us doing it poorly in the playlist compared to a gibbon doing it extremely well. And so that requires a whole bunch of weird adaptations that most species, most mammals don't have. So your arms need to be long relative to your legs. You need to have very mobile shoulder joints. Obviously, doing this is really hard for most animals, right? So that's something special that we can do on other primates. And in order to do that, your scapula has to be positioned on the back of the rib cage. So one thing we emphasized in human anatomy is that our scapula is all the way on the back of our rib cage, and that's actually unusual. When you look at most mammals, their scapula are actually on the sides, right? So like a dog's scapula is on the side of his rib cage. That's why his arm sticks straight out to the front or to the bottom, and why he's not able to rotate his arm to the side. You need long curved fingers because you're going to be grasping onto these trees with all your strength. And then most brachiators do not have a tail. It would just get in the way because they're already grabbing onto things with their arms. So we have all of those traits, not so much the long curved fingers, but we do have long arms relative to our legs. We do have mobile shoulder joints. We do have a scapula on the back of our rib cage, and we don't have a tail. And that's because our ancestors were brachiators. So we had an arboreal ancestor that moved around mostly by brachiation, and chimpanzees had the same ancestor. They do some brachiation, although not much. And a lot of our other close ancestors, all the great apes, orangutans, and gibbons, all have the ability to rotate their arm 360 degrees with the mobile scapula, which most other primates can't do. So this is actually mostly a great ape adaptation that we share with a bunch of our common ancestors. And so these are Remember going back to a couple lectures ago, the idea of analogous versus homologous traits. These are homologous traits. We have them even though we don't do the behavior they're associated with, because we have an ancestor that had them and we haven't lost them for whatever reason. And so make sure to watch the brachiation videos. Gibbons are my favorite primate. They're absolutely amazing. Okay, then you have semi-brachiation. Semi-brachiation is similar in that it's suspensory locomotion. You're using your arms to move around in the trees, but you're also using a prehensile tail. So you have long arms relative to legs again. You have mobile shoulder joints again. You have your scapula on the back of your rib cage, and you have those long curved fingers. But you have an additional adaptation, which is you have a very long tail that is able to grasp things, and it basically acts as a fifth limb. So in the example pictures here on the right, you can see how the tail acts in the same way as a limb, essentially. And again, there's a great video that I've posted in the playlist showing how a monkey uses their tail. And what I want you to really look at when you watch that video is the fact that the tail latches onto things basically automatically, right? He's not thinking carefully about how to place his tail. He just uses it instinctively as you would put down your foot or your hand in order to get around. So the big difference is that semi-brachiation doesn't involve swinging around in the trees. So when you watch the Gibbon video, look at how he uses it to move from place to place. Semi-brachiators don't use it to move from place to place to the same extent. They use it to enhance their mobility. So they'll often just walk, but they'll use their arms to, like in a tree branch, but they'll use their arms to steady themselves or their tails to hang. They're not as mobile horizontally as a brachiator. And this behavior is found only in some New World monkeys, so it's a unique adaptation to their environment or to their ancestral environment. Many New World monkeys live in the rainforest where there are going to be large trees, and they spend most of their time in the upper branches, and this adaptation is designed for that. Okay, then we have quadrupedalism, rocking on 4 feet. And quadrupedalism can be divided into a couple of sub-versions, and so we'll look at the differences between those versions. So what's quadrupedalism? Just means 4-foot walking. It's the common locomotion method seen in most mammals, so think about a dog or a horse. Those are quadrupeds, right? And so there are primates that essentially use that same locomotion method, even if their body is built a little bit differently. And then arboreal quadrupedalism just means you're walking and running in the tree branches. So arboreal is just Latin for having to do with trees. And so there's lots of arboreal animals, right? It's not limited to primates, but they all have similar adaptations. So what are the adaptations for arboreal quadrupedalism? You're going to have slightly longer legs compared to your forelimbs because you're mostly using your legs to propel yourself and your forelimbs to grasp onto things. Your scapula are going to be on the sides of the rib cage, so now we can't brachiate, right? We're more like a dog in terms of where our arms and shoulders are positioned. You're going to have prehensile hands and feet, grasping hands and feet, because you need to be able to grab onto tree branches. And then you can also use those prehensile hands to grab things like food and manipulate it. You're going to have relatively long fingers in order to hold on to branches. You're going to have a long tail that you use mostly to balance yourself. It's not prehensile. So the easy comparison here is a squirrel, and these are analogous traits, right? So these are traits that you have not because you have a common ancestor, but because you have a common behavior, and both species have adapted efficiently to carry out that behavior. So on the left, there's a squirrel, and on the right is a squirrel monkey. And as you can see, their bodies below the skull are virtually identical, right? They have the exact same body morphology, similar tails, similar leg arrangement, similar arm arrangement, prehensile hands and feet. The only difference is really in the cranium, okay? Because the squirrel has a completely different diet than the squirrel monkey, And the squirrel monkey, you can probably see, has a cranium more similar to ours in a lot of ways, especially in that it has forward-facing eyes, where the squirrel has sideways-facing eyes. But so you can see quite easily here how the squirrel and the squirrel monkey have a high degree of analogous traits. And that's because they have a high degree of analogous behavior. They basically fill the same ecological niche in different environments. Okay, then we have terrestrial quadrupedalism. And terrestrial just means, of course, on the ground, on terra. And so this is plain old walking around on the ground on four limbs, just like most mammals do. So what adaptations do you have if you are a terrestrial quadruped? Well, your legs and arms will be a similar length because you want your body to be evenly raised off the ground all the time. Your scapula are again going to be on the sides of your rib cage. You're going to have relatively short fingers because you don't need to grab things. You just need to plant your hands and feet in order to move. You don't need your tail for balance, but most of these species have not lost their tails, and so they just have a short tail that's just kind of there. And then this behavior in primates is mostly found in old world monkeys, so baboons, macaques, mandrills, geladas. Those are all species that practice terrestrial quadrupedalism, and again, they're found mostly in the old world and mostly in Africa. And so the analogous comparison here is something like a bear. And so there's a bear on the left and a baboon on the right. And again, you can see that their skeletons have a lot of analogous traits. The position of the arms and legs is similar. The proportion of the fingers, the phalanges, is similar. The position of the scapula is similar. The main differences, again, are, of course, bears have much denser, thicker bones, but also the skull, right? That the bear has a skull of a carnivore, and the baboon has a skull relatively similar to ours, and note that he has also a sagittal crest. All right, and then finally you have knuckle walking quadrupedalism. And this is an unusual adaptation found only in a few species of primates and with no parallels in other families of mammals. So in knuckle walking, you walk on all fours, just like terrestrial quadrupedalism, but the weight of the body is supported on the knuckles instead of the palms or the fingertips. So you can think about, instead of putting your hands down like that, you put your hands down like that, and then this is the part that you put all your weight on. And you can try that at home if you want and see how difficult it is. Humans can get in the position to knuckle walk, but we can't do it comfortably, of course. And so why would you do that? Well, because gorillas are huge, basically. They're quite heavy, and they have not evolved like we have to hold all that weight upright, and so they have to balance on their knuckles. Now, we know that the ancestors of gorillas were smaller brachiators because they have all of the brachiation adaptations that we do. So they have long arms relative to the legs, they have the mobile shoulder joint, their scapula is on the back of the rib cage, and they have long curved fingers. So we're quite similar to them in those respects. But they also have evolved very robust, thick finger bones, of course, because all their weight is on their knuckles a lot of the time. And then no tail, because again, they are evolved from brachiators. So this is probably a species where their ancestors were brachiators, maybe it's more similar to a chimpanzee. And through focusing on folivory, they became larger and larger and spent more and more time on the ground and eventually evolved a locomotion type that was better suited to that. And so we can then look, right, for those fossil ancestors, and we do find some species like that in the fossil record. And so this behavior is seen almost exclusively in gorillas. Chimpanzees do some knuckle walking, but they're much more mobile, and so they only use it part of the time. And so again, make sure to watch the video of the gorilla knuckle walking in the playlist, and then compare it to, behavior of other primates that you've looked at. Okay, so that wraps up the section on locomotion. And now we'll look at social organization and sexual dimorphism. So Sexual dimorphism, as a reminder, is the physical differences between the male and female form of a species. So some species are very sexually dimorphic, again, peacocks being the great example, and some species are not sexually dimorphic at all. Wolves are a good example. They're relatively non-dimorphic. And often those sexually dimorphic traits, those enlarged traits in the male form, exist because they were sexually selected for, right? So they improved reproductive success either through display. So for instance, male orangutans develop these face pouches or paddles, and we're not really sure why. It's only seen in mature males that are mating. Okay, but that's a trait that has no function that we know of, but it appears. Or they might be for display, right? So gibbons, for instance, not gibbons, baboons have very large canine fangs, which they don't use for eating meat. They use them for fighting and for threat displays. Anyway, whatever the reason is, they improve reproductive success. And then we have to ask why you need those traits in order to reproduce. Because as we see on the right, there are other primate species that have no sexual dimorphism to speak of, and it turns out that they have different mating behaviors. So we covered in the last lecture the various kinds of social organization, and we'll just run through them quickly as a review, and so that they're in the slides, and then we'll move on to the relation between sexual dimorphism and body size. So just as a reminder, you have solitary organization, where adults are mostly alone, orangutans being the example. Monogamous organization, where there are single male, single female pairs with their offspring. Polyandrous organization, where one adult female has multiple adult males that mate with her, and then they have all their offspring, golden lion tamarins being the primary example. Polygynous social organization, either in the form of single male polygyny, one male and multiple females with all their offspring. That's gorillas being the primary example. And multiple male polygyny, where you have multiple groups of males and females with all their offspring living together. Capuchin monkeys are an example of this. And then bachelor groups, where you have the male individuals who are not mating living outside the rest of the group. So how does that relate to body size? Well, it has to do with the amount of competition going on between males. So if there's no competition between males, there's not much need for sexual selection. If there's a lot of competition between males, that will drive sexual selection, and so we should see more sexual dimorphism. And so then, if we have an extinct species and we have several individuals from that species and we're able to tell their sex, we can look at sexual dimorphism and try to figure out what their social organization was like. So we can take human ancestors and look at their degree of dimorphism and try to figure out if they have the same social organization as we did or a different social organization. So what do we usually see? Monogamous social groups have low male-to-male competition, right? Every individual has their own mate, and then there are no leftovers for the most part, maybe a few bachelors, and so sexual dimorphism tends to be extremely low in those species. Single male polygynous groups and solitary groups have extremely high male-to-male competition. So in single male polygynous groups, right, only one male gets to mate. All the males want to be that male, and so they're competing a lot. And in solitary groups, each male has several females that overlap his territory, and he's trying to prevent other males from moving into that territory. So again, high degree of competition. And so sexual dimorphism is very high in those species. So again, gorillas are single male polygynous, and orangutans are solitary, and they both have very high sexual dimorphism. And multiple male polygynous groups have relatively high competition, but not as much as single male polygynous groups, right? So baboons are the example of this. There are multiple males that mate, but it's not all males, right? So some males will be left out because each male has multiple female mates. So there is competition, but it's not absolute like in gorillas. And so there is sexual dimorphism, but it's not as extreme as in single male polygynous groups. And we'll look at some visual examples of those differences with a little review. So Here are two monogamous primates with low male-to-male competition, and both examples you can see that there's not much sexual dimorphism. Males and females are more or less the same size. They have similar physical traits. They're not easy to distinguish unless you are a member of that species, right? So we can easily distinguish the humans on the left, but we can't necessarily tell which of the gibbons on the right is male, which one is female, but that is a family group with a child in the center. And so that's a great example of monogamous body size. Single male polygynous groups, again, and solitary groups have high sexual dimorphism. So there's gorilla on the left, and on the far left is the female gorilla, on the right, the male gorilla. You can see that the male gorilla is much larger, and he has a much larger sagittal crest. And you've probably heard of silverback gorillas, right? Mature males tend to have fur that changes color on their backs over time. And so those all distinguish them from females quite clearly. And orangutans, again, the male is much larger, and he has a much larger cranium, and then he has those pads on the sides of his face that grow over time. Females never develop those, and so again, they're easy to distinguish from each other. They have high sexual dimorphism. And then you have baboons, the multiple male polygynous group example. And so again, you can see that the male baboon is larger, and he has a sort of a ruff or a mane on his head, but he's not a lot larger, and he doesn't have any other distinguishing traits. So for instance, his cranium is not more robust, his body is not really that much more robust, he doesn't have larger arms or shoulders, he just has a slightly larger body size. And that ruff or mane is the main trait that distinguishes him. So multiple male polygamy, high male-to-male competition, but not as extreme sexual dimorphism as in single male polygynous groups. Okay, so those are the main points for this lecture. So review the 4 kinds of primate diet and their associated adaptations, review the different kinds of locomotion and their adaptations, and review the relationships between types of social organization and degree of sexual dimorphism. For the homework this week, take a look at the videos that I've posted in the additional material section, then do exercises 1 and 3, 4, 5, and 6, skip exercise 2, and again, use the appendix for all those exercises. That's where all the reference material is. I'll be posting some additional reference material later tonight. If you have the new lab manual, they changed the homework quite a bit in this one. I haven't decided exactly what I'm going to have you do. I will probably just post a PDF of the normal lab manual for you to do the homework on. Look for that again later tonight, and I'll send an announcement once it's been posted so that you can access it in a timely fashion. As usual, if you have any questions at all, please let me know. Contact me however you like. I've been receiving everyone's homework and it all looks great. So keep it up and we'll move on to the end of the semester. And so I hope you all have a great day and I will see you next time.